So please join me in welcoming to the stage our hosts tonight, KQED's Senior Politics and Government Editor Scott Shafer and Politics Correspondent Marisa Lagos.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Great to see you here for this conversation with San Francisco's District Attorney Chesa Boudin. I'm Scott Shafer.
And I'm Marisa Lagos. We're just a month away from the June 7th primary election, which in San Francisco includes Proposition H, asking whether or not to recall Chesa Boudin about halfway through his 4-year term.
Boudin, as you may know, was elected in 2019, promising to change priorities in the DA's office to reduce incarceration, especially for lower-level nonviolent crimes, and to put more of an emphasis on diversion and rehabilitation.
Then the pandemic hit. Crime rates have gone up all over the country, and it's put progressive prosecutors like Boudin on the defensive. Now he is facing this recall election.
And he's here tonight to talk with us about the challenges of being a champion for criminal justice reform when the crime rates are rising, as well as his response to this effort to recall him.
Please welcome District Attorney Chesa Boudin. Thanks for being here.
Good to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming.
Just a note before we dive in. We know that emotions around this recall are running high in San Francisco, and we intend tonight to have a civil conversation. So if you interrupt the program, we will ask you to leave. And we want to hear your questions. We have time at the end to hear what the audience is wondering. So you have cards, write them down, we'll collect them, and we will get to them. All right, let's get started.
All right, let's do it. Chesa, we didn't really expect to begin tonight's conversation talking about your family, but we know that you had a loss in your family. Your mom, Kathy Boudin, died this past weekend. Our condolences to you. She sounds like she was quite an extraordinary woman.
Yeah, she died on May 1st, just a couple days ago. She'd been fighting cancer for 7 years. I was lucky to be at her bedside when she died with my father. And I know there's never a good time to lose someone you love, someone as close as a mother is. And I know she desperately wanted to live long enough to see me beat this recall. So it's a sad time. It's just a week before what would have been her first Mother's Day as a grandmother.
Wow. We have a picture of you with your mom when you were much younger, and you had an interesting childhood, let's say. Both of your parents were part of the Radical Weather Underground group. They served time for their part in a robbery. And you were very young when that happened initially. And of course, you grew up having your parents incarcerated. How did that affect you?
I don't remember being 14 months old and them leaving me at the babysitter and never coming back. I don't remember them getting arrested, or even when the judge sentenced my mother to 20 years to life and my father to 75 years to life. My first memories are waiting in lines at prison gates to go through metal detectors, just to be able to give my parents a hug. And even before I understood what the law was or how the criminal justice system worked or what mass incarceration was, I noticed as a child that the lines at those prisons were almost all women and children of color. It affected me because I saw and lived firsthand the failures of this country's approach to crime and public safety. I saw that we'd built a system of mass incarceration. We led the world in locking people up, and it wasn't making us safer. We weren't rehabilitating people who'd committed crimes. We weren't meaningfully supporting victims of crime. And it was bankrupting local governments, starving our communities of the resources needed to invest in education and housing and mental health or drug treatment.
How did it affect the way you think about second chances and taking responsibility for what you've done?
Well, I know that we all get second chances in life. All of us do, and we need them, and I believe in them. I also know that we have to take responsibility for the mistakes that we made. I watched my parents. My mother pled guilty to a crime that she committed, and she served a very serious sentence as a result. She expressed remorse, again, before I can remember, and consistently to me, to the public, and in every way and opportunity she had. She lived her life in a way that exemplifies redemption. While she was in prison, she did life-saving work around HIV/AIDS during the height of the pandemic. She taught literacy and parenting classes to other incarcerated women. I grew up watching someone who had done a terrible thing that had cost lives, that had destroyed families and ripped a community apart. And I watched the ways in which she reinvented herself to try and make good for all the people around her. I believe that we are all more than our worst mistake. I know, because I've seen it, that human beings have the capacity to change. And that's a critical thing we cannot forget when we do this work, any work.
So a lot of the things you're talking about right now are the things you ran on, right? And the climate politically, socially has changed, whiplashed even in the last few years since your election and when you ran in 2019. We've seen, especially property crimes in San Francisco, increase, and a lot of concern among the public, a lot of people that don't feel safe. What do you sort of make of this moment before we get into the details on your term, politically, and just, the change between the conversations we were having when you were running, the George Floyd protest, and how we've come around since then?
The world has changed a lot since I ran for office, since I was sworn in to office, and I've had a steep learning curve. I've learned a lot. I was never an elected official before. I was never a prosecutor before I was sworn in. I also had never heard of Zoom before I was sworn in, right? So it's been a steep learning curve on lots of fronts, and in a context in which everything about the work we do has changed. The courtrooms in which we prosecute cases have been reduced to about 10% of their pre-pandemic capacity. Every kind of challenge you can imagine we've confronted. Look, at the end of the day, what my office does and what my priority is making people safe in San Francisco. We want people to be safe, we want people to feel safe, and when people don't feel safe, whether it's because crime rates are rising or because there's a perception that crime rates are rising, or maybe some of both, we've got work to do. And that's why we're focused on things that are not only going to react to changing crime trends, which is what traditional prosecutors do, but we're being proactive. That's why, for example, I look at guns and gun violence. That's the #1 threat to public safety anywhere in this country. And we're not going to sit back and wait for the next murder or the next case police bring to us. We proactively went after companies that are manufacturing ghost guns, guns that are designed to be used in crimes, to be untraceable, to be sold to anybody and everybody, including people with a criminal record. That's the kind of proactive approach that I and my office are taking to lead the way on making San Francisco the safest city in America.
One of the reasons there is a perception that crime is going up is a lot of these viral videos that we've seen with smash and grab, crimes downtown. And there was one in particular that I think was one of the earlier videos where this guy was in a Walgreens on a bicycle, and he, rode out of the drugstore with a bag full of stuff that he had taken. And that is not the kind of crime that I think you ran on cracking down on. It was not a violent crime; it was a property crime. And yet, when you got a conviction there, your office put out a press release to let people know. And I'm wondering, was it hard to get your head around that change in role? From being a public defender, trying to get somebody like that off, to putting them, to account for what they've done.
The part that was hard about the transition was not precisely what you're asking about. The part that was hard is that as a lawyer, as a public defender, or pretty much any other kind of lawyer besides a government lawyer, prosecutor, you have an ethical obligation to your client. You represent an individual, whether that individual is accused of a crime or whether it's a corporate client, whatever it is. And so you know that to be a zealous advocate means to fight for that one person or entity. As the District Attorney of San Francisco, I represent everybody. I represent the people of the city and county of San Francisco. That includes people who have no connection to the particular crime. It includes people who have vastly divergent views about what accountability should look like. It includes the victim and the defendant. We represent everybody. So figuring out how to balance competing interests in that case, or far more serious cases, is the challenge. I've always said we need to do a better job holding people accountable. I said that in 2019 as a candidate. It doesn't mean that jails and prisons should be the first response. For lots of crimes, they should be the last response. We know that they're expensive, they're inhumane, and they're actually criminogenic. They actually create crime. There's ample evidence and academic research that shows us, for lower level offenses especially, diversion programs are a far more effective way to prevent future crime while holding people accountable in ways that are meaningful.
So what is success for you? Because historically, prosecutors have really held up conviction rates. I think if you know anything about the criminal justice system, that in itself can be problematic because most cases are pled out. But how are you measuring success?
Well, conviction rates also incentivize individual prosecutors and prosecutors' offices to cut corners. And cutting corners can lead to wrongful convictions. It can lead to withholding evidence. One of the things that I committed to doing in 2019, and this is the heart of your question, Marisa, we measure success in part based on following through on the commitments that we made to voters. I committed to create a model independent innocence commission, and I did that, led by a professor, a retired judge, forensic experts. And just a couple weeks ago, they identified a man who had been wrongfully convicted of a murder, served 32 years in state prison for a murder he did not commit. And a judge in San Francisco reversed that conviction. That's doing justice not only going forward, but also looking backwards. We measure success based on the extent to which we can implement policies and practices that are ethical, that are evidence-based, and that make San Francisco safer. I'm particularly interested in more effective ways to hold people accountable and increasing investment and services for victims of crime.
So how should voters make that assessment, given some of the things you're talking about we may not know the answers to for years?
That's true. Recidivism, for example, is usually measured in increments that are longer than I've been in office. That's another part of the problem with the recall, right? It's not about good policy. It's about politics. They're not interested in a conversation about what would actually make us safer. Nobody who's supporting this recall is looking at evidence-based practices or talking to criminologists. They're promoting fear, and they're using the kinds of tragedies that occur in every jurisdiction in this country to undermine policies that are grounded in racial justice, evidence, and public safety.
You still have to, if you're a victim of crime, and we've all been victims of property crime in the past several years.
And before that.
And before that as well. The good point.
To be fair.
To be fair. But if you're a victim or your family has been victimized, you want some measure of accountability. You
Absolutely.
want there to be some kind of punishment. You want them to pay a price.
We all need that.
Yes.
Not just the victims. All of us as a city, as a society, we need accountability when people commit crimes.
And so what do you say to those who might feel, the statistics may not actually bear it out, but they feel that you're soft on crime, that you're too much looking for diversion, or that you're looking for the root causes, but this crime happened and you have to deal with it.
And the criminals have that message, right? That's a lot of the rhetoric, is this idea that you are soft on crime and therefore people are doing things they might not have done otherwise.
I've heard a few people on Twitter say that.
Yeah.
The
paragon of civil conversation.
Exactly. Well, but the reality is facts matter, right? So let me just give a few facts. I've been in office less than 2.5 years. The recall started the week I was sworn in, but I've been in office less than 2.5 years. If you look at the police department's crime dashboard, this isn't my data. This is crimes reported to the San Francisco Police Department during the time I've been in office, and you compare it to the exact same time period prior to my administration, there have been 26,000 fewer reported crimes during my tenure. 26,000 fewer crimes. That's about a 20% decline in reported property crime and about a 19% decline in reported violent crime.
To be fair, the whole world locked down for
Totally.
several months.
Oh yeah, I'm not taking credit. I'm just saying if there's a perception that crime is rising, and if it is rising in certain categories, which we know it is, and to be fair, the whole world locked down and the world changed and crime trends changed, to focus on me or on my office as somehow being responsible for changes in the context of a global pandemic is not only dishonest, it's dangerous because it simplifies and dumbs down a conversation that we need to be having collectively about what is going to make us safer. And we've done studies, outside agencies, peer-reviewed academic studies that predate my administration about diversion, for example. The California Policy Lab did a study over a 10-year period, predating my administration, that showed people who were in diversion programs were about 20% less likely than people prosecuted traditionally to get rearrested in the future. That's how we build safety.
What do you say to folks who say, you mentioned there are fewer crimes being reported. There have been reports also that the SFPD isn't responding to calls. And there's a sense that sometimes it's not worth even calling because nothing's going to happen. Either the cops are not going to do the investigation. They're not going to arrest anyone, or they're going to hand it over to you, and you're going to not take it seriously, not bring it to trial, or not, press charges, bring charges. So what's your response to that dynamic? How important is it for the DA and the cops to have a good, healthy, trusting relationship? Because that doesn't seem to exist right now.
No, there's a need for the police department to do their job so we can do ours. And let's take auto burglaries, an issue that we know has plagued this city for at least a decade, right? 31,000 auto burglaries were reported in 2017. That was the year they hit peak. We probably had double that number because a lot weren't reported back then either. Today, police are solving about 1% of reported auto burglaries. We're either filing new criminal charges or taking some other action to hold people accountable in about 90% of the cases police bring us. But there's a problem. I don't care whether you believe in the death penalty or restorative justice, anything in the middle. We can't hold people accountable using any approach if police don't make arrests. And if you're only making arrests in 1% of reported auto burglaries, no wonder, as Marisa was saying, some people think they can get away with crimes. Has nothing to do with my policies, has nothing to do with what we're doing in the courts or not doing in the courts. If you commit an auto burglary in San Francisco, there is a 99% chance, even if it gets reported, that the police will not arrest you. Chief Scott, in front of the police commission a couple weeks ago, was asked about this, was asked about why clearance rates, the rate at which police are solving crimes that are reported, has declined by about 60% over the last 10 years. They asked him about auto burglaries and property crimes. He says most of the time, there's zero follow-up investigation. That's a problem that's way upstream, and whoever the district attorney is, today, tomorrow, 10 years from now, we can't solve that problem if police aren't figuring out how to make arrests.
So what can we do then to lower property crimes here? I mean, a lot of what you've talked about obviously is aimed at getting at root causes, but again, takes time. The police department will say part of the problem is we don't have enough staff. What do you see as the chief law enforcement officer here as a way to tackle what are truly, to your point, staggering statistics when we talk about smash and grabs, auto burglary, and increasingly shoplifting?
Yeah, these have been huge problems in San Francisco for at least a decade. And so again, we need to be clear about causality. The recall folks want victims of crime and the public in general to associate these crimes with my administration. But the data shows they were far more prevalent in 2017, 18, and 19 than they are today. Still real problems that we need to solve. So here's what we do about it. First of all, a historic expansion of victim services. When people are victimized, even if police don't make an arrest, which they don't in most cases, we need to make sure that we're stepping up to help victims. When I took office, there had never been a single victim advocate focusing on property crime victims. We created a victim advocacy team focusing on property crime. That's a small step. The other thing is we need to recognize that what's driving property crime in San Francisco, regardless of the root causes for individual people arrested shoplifting or stealing from cars, is massive international fencing operations. We need to do a much more effective job detecting and dismantling the operations that are creating demand for stolen goods. In other words, we have an organized retail theft task force that my office has been an integral part of. In my first year, we participated in a multi-jurisdiction operation that seized $8 million in retail goods that had been stolen from San Francisco. Just last week, in partnership with Alcohol ABC, the Alcohol Beverage Enforcement Agency of the state of California, we went after a fencing operation at a retail store here in San Francisco. We need to stop focusing narrowly on that person in the video that gets arrested shoplifting, because police make arrests in 1 or 2% of those cases. We need to instead focus on breaking up the networks that are moving millions and millions of dollars of stolen goods, and that's exactly where I'm putting my energy.
And to be clear, we're talking about two separate things here. I feel like we conflate a lot, but shoplifting, even someone who's taken a lot of stuff, is different than a fencing operation or car thieves, which criminologists have described to me as a career you need a lot of skills and connections for. So on the second, do you feel like you're talking about these investigations? Are these things that you're collaborating with the police on? Are these conversations you're having with federal officials? I mean, these seem like way bigger issues than just San Francisco that you're detailing.
Absolutely. These are not problems limited to San Francisco at all. I mean, we see stolen goods from San Francisco move across the world. Vietnam, Russia, all over, we see our stolen goods turn up with, tracking these days. You can find Apple products all over the world that originated in somebody's parked car at the Palace of Fine Arts. We are collaborating with anybody who is willing to work with us in good faith. Absolutely the San Francisco Police Department, absolutely other law enforcement agencies, Highway Patrol, Sheriff's Department, and beyond. The problem that Scott mentioned a minute ago about the relationship between the district attorney's office.
You said in good faith. What does that mean?
Well, what it means is that the police unions in San Francisco, and Lincoln Mitchell had an op-ed in the Examiner about the history of the POA, I think 2 days ago in the Examiner, worth reading, going back to the 70s, an organization that has resisted, viciously resisted, every single criminal justice reform, integration of the police department, policies aimed at reducing use of police force or increasing police accountability. And not just that, they've attacked every single district attorney going back at least 30 years. I was at an event, a house party, about a week ago in the Richmond district. And one of the people who happened to be at the party was a retired police officer. And they came up to me, introduced themselves, and they said that they started policing our streets in San Francisco well before Terrence Hallinan was elected. And they said even when they first started, they were trained, don't work too hard, don't make too many arrests, tell people it's the DA's fault. When Terrence Hallinan was the DA, we all know Fajita Gate, they went after him, he was a defense lawyer, police didn't want to work with him, but it didn't stop there. Our vice president, Kamala Harris, was district attorney in San Francisco. And she followed through, as I have, on campaign promises made to voters that won me the election. She promised not to seek the death penalty. And when she took office, the police union didn't think that was okay. And they put tremendous pressure on her.
This is after a police officer was shot and killed.
Sure, and they wanted the death penalty. And she was standing by a promise she had made to the voters who had elected her.
Yeah.
And they attacked her viciously for the rest of her term. Then, Gavin Newsom, the mayor, appoints George Gascon to be the next district attorney. Gascon had been the chief of police in San Francisco. If anybody is going to have a chance at working productively with the police department, it's the former chief of police. They attacked him throughout his entire tenure. This is not a new problem. This is not a problem in the district attorney's office. This is a problem with the police union being out of touch with San Francisco values, being reactionary, being retrograde, being racist, and being unwilling to accept reforms that promote trust in law enforcement.
Obviously, the POA did not endorse you when you ran. I think we have a picture of you and the police chief, Bill Scott. And I'm wondering, there is this problem between your office and the police in terms of trust and cooperation. What
and
role?
The mayor, we should
and
say.
the mayor, yes, and the mayor as well. And I'm wondering if you feel you have gone the extra length to improve that relationship. What did you do after you got elected to make that relationship better? Because I assume while you can make the argument that it's important to have an independent DA, you also need to have a decent working, trusting relationship.
Absolutely, and we do. You can see Chief Scott and I, this is at an event. This wasn't planned. We both separately showed up because it was an issue we cared about. It was a vigil for victims of gun violence. Chief Scott and I text, we talk on the phone. We have a very, very robust back and forth relationship. We don't always, meaning it's vibrant. We don't always agree, but we have very good channels of communication. And when we disagree, we talk about it respectfully, and we understand that we have different jobs. We need to work together, but we also have to stay in our lanes. And he makes decisions I don't agree with, but I respect that he's got a job to do and a department to run. And he says the same thing about me. I know that just like I want his department's clearance rates to go up, he wants them to go up. I know that, and he knows that, like me, we both want the ways in which my office holds people accountable to be more effective. These are things that we share a common cause around. The fact is, the departments are big institutions, and we have thousands of different points of contact every day. Individual officers coming in to testify in cases, being examined by my line prosecutors, command staff working with my managers, the chief and I, the mayor. We all share a commitment to making San Francisco as safe and as magnificent a city as it can be. My son was born here. My wife and I got married here. This is the city that we call home. We all share a commitment to do whatever we can to make this city the world-class city that we all want to live in.
Yeah, I want to switch gears a little bit. We're on the same wavelength, Scott. It's like we've done this
Mind meld.
before. I want to talk about the internal workings of your office. This is something that some of the prosecutors who have left your office or are supporting the recall have talked a lot about. One statistic, at least 40% of your attorneys have left since you got there. Some of them you asked to leave, some retired, some quit. And I think it's fair, you're a new administration, you're going to bring in new blood, but we've also seen a lot of public defenders come over to that office. And I guess my first question is, do you feel that they have the experience to do the job, which is different than being a public defender, right? And what kind of systems have you put in place to ensure that folks have the training and expertise, especially if, supervising attorneys are also pretty new to this line of work?
Well, a couple things. The most expensive defense attorneys in the country tend to be retired prosecutors. And there's a reason why people with unlimited resources hire a former prosecutor when they need a defense lawyer. It's a similar reason to why some of the people I've recruited to be prosecutors are former defense lawyers. You need to know how the other side thinks. You need to anticipate what they're going to do. There's nothing unusual.
But is that why you hired them?
Yeah, some of them. Some of them. And if you want to look at the record that they have, some of our best trial lawyers in these last 2 years have been former defense attorneys. I'm thinking of one lawyer in particular. She tried more cases than any other lawyer in the office during the pandemic. And I'm talking about serious cases, violent cases, sex crime cases, and she tried them successfully. Former defense attorney, amazing track record doing that work. The other thing that's important to remember is the recall wants you to focus on a handful of people I hired who are former defense attorneys. What they're not talking about is the more than a dozen people we've hired who are former prosecutors. Many of them former prosecutors from within the San Francisco District Attorney's Office. People who left under prior administrations, saw the work that I was doing, saw the leadership of our office team, and wanted to come back and be part of that team. We've recruited people back to the office who had left to go work for DAs in Sonoma County, who had gone to work for the Attorney General, DAs from the Sacramento office. And here's the other thing that's important. All across the state, all across the country, there's a phenomenon known as the Great Resignation. I just saw a news report on TV this morning that said 47 million people across this country quit their job in 2021, the most on record in any year in American history. They're trying to focus on our office for political reasons. Every single district attorney in the state of California right now is having a hard time retaining their staff. When I talk to other elected DAs, some of them, 20, 30% of their attorney positions are vacant. They can't hire people. We have people banging down the door to come work for us. I'm doing an interview tomorrow with a Los Angeles County District Attorney. He's been a career prosecutor in LA. We just hired somebody, amazing resume out of law school. Last week we did an interview with somebody who's got 20 years of practice, including working as a prosecutor for government agencies. The domestic violence team that I've created, I've recruited and hired folks who are the premier domestic violence expert prosecutors in the state of California, from the AG's office, from Sacramento County, from Sonoma County. We have people literally banging down our doors, interviewing as fast as we can to replace vacancies. I am really proud of the team I've built, including former prosecutors and former defense attorneys.
One of the issues that has understandably really upset the city generally, but the Asian American community in particular, are some of the vicious anti-Asian hate crimes. And I want to ask you about one in particular because of the way you handled that. There were two men involved. This was a 68-year-old person in the Bayview who was collecting cans to turn in for recycling.
February 2020 on Osceola Lane.
Exactly. And there were two guys. One beat him up, made fun of him, while the other one shot a video of him.
I got to correct your facts.
Please.
Because these are important.
Yeah.
But I know the case, as you
Yep.
can tell.
Yeah.
One of them, you had a stick, was another recycler, had a stick and threatened him with the stick, swung it at him, and then stole his cans. That's what we call an assault for the stick and a robbery for using force or fear to take the cans. And we filed those charges against him once police made arrest. The other one had no connection to the robber. He was there, like a lot of people were, watching and making fun of the victim and videoing it.
Not a good thing.
Not a good thing. Offensive, horrific, racist, disrespectful behavior. Outrageous. Not criminal.
Yeah.
It is not a crime to make a video of somebody else committing a crime. It's not a crime to be racist. As offensive as it is, as distasteful, as much as we as a city condemn and reject that kind of behavior, for me to file a criminal case, ethically, we have to have a crime that corresponds to the action of the person we're prosecuting. And making a video of someone else being a victim of crime is not a crime.
But there was a charge, right?
He was not charged.
He was not.
He was not
diversion,
charged.
right?
What we did was first of all, the police arrested him, and we looked at the evidence and we said there's no cognizable charge from this behavior. If he had been complicit in the robbery, if he'd been participating in the robbery, if he had used force against the victim, absolutely we would have been able to file criminal charges. But simply being disrespectful, racist, rude, and making a video is not a crime.
What did the victim want?
The victim wanted us not to move forward with charges. He was very clear. We worked with a community partner. The victim was a Toisanese speaker. And so we worked with interpreters through community organizations that were helping the victim with housing and with the other immediate aftermath of being a victim of a violent crime. He said unequivocally that he did not want us to move forward and prosecute, that he didn't want to testify, and he particularly said with regard to the younger man who had made the video, that he understood that this young man had made a mistake, that he was young, that young people need education, they need to learn, and that he wanted an apology. We tried to follow his lead, and we referred this young man to a diversion program, a restorative justice program, through which he was able to articulate his apology, to come to terms with the ways in which his behavior, whether or not a crime was alleged against him, was absolutely unacceptable and shattered a sense of safety and security, not only for the victim, but for so many of our Asian American brothers, sisters, and siblings in this city. It is devastating to look around. That was before the pandemic. A month later, President Trump started scapegoating Chinese Americans, started using racist, inflammatory rhetoric, empowering white supremacists across the country. In Atlanta, there was a mass shooting. In San Francisco, we've seen an increase in not just hate crimes, but hate speech. We know the cause of that is white supremacy. We know the cause of that is Donald Trump empowering racism and xenophobia and scapegoating. And we know that the Chinese American community, in San Francisco in particular, has suffered with dignity and with pride and with perseverance racism and oppression and exclusion as long as there have been Chinese Americans in this city. We are proud of the history of Chinese American perseverance. We're proud of our Chinatown, the oldest in America. We're proud of being the city in the 48 United States, continental United States, with the biggest Asian American population. And we are proud of the work I've done as district attorney and my office has done to expand services specifically for Asian American crime victims. When I started, Scott, we had one Chinese-speaking victim advocate in the entire office. One. I appointed the first ever Chinese American head of victim services. We increased the number of Chinese-speaking staff in our office by well over 500%.
And I think we have a picture of you
say,
in Chinatown. What do you say, there must be, you must hear from folks who are victims. They see elders being assaulted or, beaten, and they want retribution. They want hate crime charges. What do you say to folks? Because those are not easy charges to get convictions on, right?
Yeah, the first thing is, look, whether it's a hate crime or just any old crime, a robbery, an assault, a murder, we need to do a better job keeping our community safe. We need our Asian elders to feel safe doing their errands, going to the grocery store, taking public transportation. And I hear from people who are scared.
Angry.
And angry. They want to be protected. They want to know that they can go out and about, live their lives without being targeted, especially without being targeted because of their skin color or their language or their immigration status. And we as a city need that. We need that to return to the San Francisco pre-pandemic that we all love. This picture that you have up on the screen, this picture was taken in the weeks before the city shut down. The very last public event that I did before the mayor shut the city down was this event that you have on screen. And it was an event we did because we saw, back in March of 2020, we saw the rising tide of anti-Asian sentiment. We saw what Trump was doing. And so I made it a priority back then to do everything I could to stand up and stand with the Chinese community. We did merchant walks. This is a merchant walk on the San Bruno corridor that we did where we said, this is not a Chinese virus, the way Trump is saying. This isn't only Chinese businesses or Chinese communities that are impacted. Come shop in Chinese businesses. Continue to spend money. We did a public safety announcement that we asked media outlets to broadcast, informing the community about hate crimes and about the scapegoating that was happening before the city had even shut down. And more than that, when it comes to holding people accountable, I am really proud of my record when it comes to crimes against Asian Americans. I have personally gone to the hospital to visit Asian American victims of violent crime. I've personally gone to court and argued to detain people who've committed violent crimes, because I don't think it's safe for some of them to be released from custody. And we have a dedicated hate crime specialist in our office who doesn't only handle hate crimes, every single hate crime that comes into the office, but also is a point of contact with other district attorney offices around the Bay Area. And through that partnership and that liaison, we've been able to file hate crimes in cases that were presented to us as by police as a simple assault. Because we've made the connection, we've seen a pattern of behavior, we've cooperated and collaborated with other law enforcement agencies, and we've been able to do the job the community wants. And look, the leadership in Chinatown, the leadership in the Chinese and Asian American community in San Francisco, they see the work we're doing, the partnerships we're forging, the ways in which we are expanding resources for victims of crime, the ways in which we're increasing accountability for people who cause harm in the community. And you look at who's opposing this recall in the Asian American community, the Chinese leadership. I am proud to stand with every current and former recently elected Chinese American, former president of the Board of Supervisors, Norman Yee, Mabel Tang, Phil Ting, Gordon Marr, Eric Marr, Sandra Lee Feuer, the Rose Pack Democratic Club. We could go on and on. The leadership of the Chinese community sees Judge Tang, Julie Tang, folks who see the work that we're doing every day, who understand the challenges that we face, are saying to voters, reject this recall. Vote no on Proposition H.
All right, you brought up pretrial detention, and this is an interesting one because I first met you because of bail reform, right? You
might have been on this stage in a different iteration of this auditorium.
It was a phone call, if I recall properly, but the first time we talked was around, this issue of bail reform, money bail reform, and the idea that it's not fair to hold people in jail pre-trial just because they don't have the money to get out. And a lot's changed since then, both because of state policy, but also because of the pandemic and the fact that a lot of people, there was a push within the larger court system to not hold people. But I'm curious, you also talk a lot about how judges overrule your lawyers a lot, and you were asking for pre-trial detention. And I guess I'm wondering if you feel like anything that you pushed is backfiring now in the cases you see.
Well, let's be really clear for folks who aren't as familiar as you are about what money bail is, how it works, and how it doesn't work. Money bail is a system really unique to the United States and the Philippines, where we have for-profit companies that make the decision about who is in jail pending trial and who gets out. And it's a system that's based on wealth. It's really problematic for two reasons. The first one is that it undermines equal protection under law because it results in poor people who are presumed innocent being held in jail simply because of their poverty. It also undermines public safety. And as district attorney, one of the things that's unacceptable to me is that under a money bail system, someone who's really dangerous can be back on the streets within hours simply because they have enough money to pay a bail bondsman. We've replaced a wealth-based system with a risk-based system. If we believe somebody poses a public safety risk, and I campaigned on this, if we believe somebody is too dangerous, even though they're presumed innocent and awaiting trial, to be released, we're going to ask the court to detain them. Now, the decision is always up to the judge.
Which is arguably more serious than a bail setting, right? Because you're asking for preventative detention.
Absolutely, it is. But the problem with money bail is that what prosecutors have done throughout this country and in San Francisco until very recently is they have used money bail as a proxy for detention without any of the procedural protections that defendants are guaranteed, undermining, as the California Supreme Court recently found, undermining both due process and equal protection. It's also problematic because judges and prosecutors are guessing at how much money somebody has. They're guessing, they're saying, we don't want you to get out of jail, so we're going to set bail at $1 million. But some people have $1 million, or they've got a rich uncle.
Right. Well, talk about how you get to these decisions. It sounds like no regrets on the policies you've supported.
Lots of regrets and a steep learning curve. But I don't have any regrets about being on the right side of what was I believe, unanimous Supreme Court decision in the California Supreme Court.
What have you learned?
What I've learned is that the system is really complicated and imperfect and poorly understood. We cannot solve problems alone in my office. The police can't do it alone. The judges can't do it alone. We have to work together. And we have to do it in ways that are more effective than we've ever done it before.
So how do you arrive at the decision to ask for pretrial detention or not? Is there a specific system? I know we've had risk assessments in San Francisco. Those are not perfect, right, and they've always relied on the judgment of attorneys and judges to look at them as well?
So we're looking at a few different factors. And I want to be clear, my lawyers make this decision on a very, very short timeline. We usually have less than 48 hours to make a decision after an arrest, both about what charges to file and about whether or not to seek someone's detention. We do it based on the risk assessment algorithm that the court uses. It's called the Arnold tool, the PSA. We also do it based on the individual's criminal history. And we also do it based on the facts of the case. So if we have someone, for example, who is accused of a very serious violent crime, we're likely to ask for their detention regardless of what the risk assessment says, regardless of whether they have a criminal history. If someone commits an attempted murder and we have strong, compelling evidence, we don't want them to get out and go finish the job. We want them to be held until we can prove our case. And we ask judges to do that. Sometimes they agree, sometimes they disagree. We respect the checks and balances of the system. It's how our founders of this country designed every level of government. No one person or agency is supposed to be all-powerful. And that's as it should be.
Yeah.
How often do you overrule your attorney's decisions on charging or these types of pretrial decisions?
Exceedingly rarely. We've filed about 10,000 plus criminal cases since I took office. It would be impossible for me to read every police report or even know the facts of every case. So the idea that I'm going to be micromanaging the decisions of every lawyer in the office, it's just not realistic.
One of the prosecutors who left,
Sure.
Went public, said that you intervened in some of these decisions without consulting them, and they were more ideological and political than based on risk. What's your response to that?
That's a lie. It's really simple. There are some folks who won't let facts get in the way of their ambition. And it's disappointing to have what needs to be a nuanced, complicated conversation about public safety distracted by people's individual career ambitions. In that particular case, not only did I have a lengthy conversation with the individual prosecutor on a weekend, because I work 7 days a week, sometimes to my wife's chagrin, but we also had lots of conversations with the supervisor of that prosecutor and with the supervisor of that prosecutor. We have a chain of command. We have structures in place so that if I'm being asked to make a decision in a case, I get briefed on it by lawyers who understand it. And if I have questions, I talk with the lawyer who's closest to the facts. And I did that in this case. And the lawyer asked to pursue a particular course that I was uncomfortable with.
Can you say what it was?
Sure. The lawyer believed that someone who was severely mentally ill should go to prison for the rest of their life. And the family of the victim understood the mental illness at issue and overwhelmingly wanted this person to go to a locked state hospital, not state prison.
What was the crime?
Murder. And the lawyer said that they believed, notwithstanding the opinions of 3 separate expert witnesses, 2 of them appointed by the court, not hired by the defense, that this person legally was so mentally ill that they had to go to a state hospital, not prison. Notwithstanding those 3 expert opinions, this particular prosecutor really wanted to send this young mentally ill man to prison for life. I was uncomfortable with it, but I deferred to her judgment as the lawyer prosecuting the case, and I let her make the case to the jury. And the jury disagreed with her. They wouldn't agree as a jury to send this young man to prison, to find that he was sane at the time of his crime. And after the jury came back and said, we're deadlocked, half of us don't think he was sane, I said, we've had enough. The family wants him to go to a mental hospital. 6 of the jurors want him to go to the mental hospital. And you've had your best shot at it. The jury didn't agree. They didn't buy what you were selling. And we're going to respect the family's wishes.
You bring up what the victim's family wanted. There are clearly other cases that have been brought up in this recall where the victims are not happy with the charges that you filed or the way that you've handled them. How much weight do you give in your office, your lawyers, to crime victims and survivors and what they want? And what's the appropriate balance there? Because to your point, you are not a lawyer for them. You are a lawyer for the people.
One of the most important and often difficult parts of my job is meeting with victims. And I've met with so many families who have dealt with a homicide or survivors of sexual assault, and victims of less serious crimes too. It's a critical part of my job. Everywhere I go in the community, I talk to people who've been victims of property crime. And as difficult as those conversations are, it's something that I always keep with me. those conversations, the pain, the suffering, and the challenges that we as a system, not just my office, but collectively across this country have with finding meaningful ways to make people who've been harmed whole are very real, deep challenges. And there are some victims who want the death penalty after they've had their car broken into, right? It's not normal, but there's some of them who want that. And there's some who are victims of horrific family sexual violence who don't want prosecution at all. And in either of those cases, as much as we respect their wishes and where they're coming from, we are not going to follow what they're asking for. I am not going to seek the death penalty after property crimes are committed, or ever, because I don't believe in the death penalty. I'm proud that I got the last person on death row out of San Francisco off of death row. I'm proud that I ended the death penalty for San Francisco. I'm also not going to simply dismiss a family sexual violence case because a victim says, I don't want to cooperate, or a domestic violence victim says, I don't want to cooperate. So it is a balancing act, and it's a tough one.
We are going to take some audience questions, so if you have a question, you should write it down, pass it to the middle, and they'll get collected and hand it to me. There's Ryan over there. Give it to him. You talked about a balance, trying to strike a balance, and one of the things that you promised is to hold police accountable in cases of excessive use of force, and I believe you prosecuted 5 cases. There was a guilty plea by 1 police officer. What impact, that may have been the right thing to do, but what impact do you think that's had on your relationship with the department?
Well, there's no question that the police union demands and expects impunity for its members. We've seen that across the country. We've seen the reaction, not only to me, but to any prosecutor who tries to hold police accountable. It's telling that in all of San Francisco history, as far as we're aware, there's never been, until my administration, a jury trial against an on-duty police officer for excessive force of any kind, not just gun violence, any kind of violence. Does anybody in this audience, does anybody watching really think that until 2020, there was never a single instance where a San Francisco police officer used unlawful excessive force? Nobody thinks that.
Yeah. The jury acquitted in that case, though, didn't they?
They did in that case, after 4 hours of difficult deliberation. They did. Some people get convicted of crimes, some people get acquitted of crimes. It's a process that we respect. The jury worked tremendously hard, and the entire police department pulled out all the stops to help ensure that that police officer was not convicted for crime. We respect the outcome of cases, win or lose, but we cannot lose because we don't try. And in San Francisco history, that's been the case. That's been what we've seen throughout this city's history, throughout this country's history, is a refusal by elected law enforcement officials, district attorneys, to enforce laws equally, to hold police accountable when they commit crimes. And look, this isn't just about the relationship with the police department or the police union. They attacked me before I filed the first case. They spent $600,000.
I mean, to be fair, I don't think they liked you.
That's what I'm
From the
saying.
get-go.
Exactly. I mean, and if there was any doubt about it, the hate mail that they sent to everybody in the Bay Area, the TV ads they put out in 2019, before I'd even been elected, made it very, very clear how they felt. So you can say this is a result of a decision to file criminal charges against police officers who use excessive force, but they made that decision way before I was elected. The reality is, as district attorney, I don't work for the police. I don't represent the police. I represent the people of the city and county of San Francisco. And if we're going to have folks trust police enough to call and report crime, to cooperate when I need them to testify in a criminal case to secure a conviction, we need the community to understand that we don't have a double standard, that we have a system of justice that works for everybody, not just the wealthy and powerful.
Can I ask, though, you put 3 prosecutors on that case. I think most homicide cases have 1. I mean, is that proportional?
It's proportional to the resources that we were up against in that case. No criminal defendant, probably in the history of San Francisco, has ever had as much support as that police officer defendant did. They've never had they had police officers coming in to testify for him. People who hadn't given us their statements, who weren't cooperating with us. We had the police department blow up a long-standing agreement, use lies and misinformation and spin to justify walking away from an agreement so that they could generate press to taint the credibility of that process. That never happens in a criminal case.
You think the chief tried to taint the credibility
I think
of
the
that
department
case?
did. I think the department did. I think the police union absolutely did. And I think they put the chief in a very, very difficult position.
What do you think of the media coverage you've gotten?
Sorry, what was the question? No, I couldn't hear.
I thought you were stunned. What?
No, I heard you. I heard you.
Yeah. I thought you-
The media is a fourth branch of government. We've got the judiciary, we've got the legislature, we've got the executive. I'm part of the executive branch. The media really is a fourth branch. We need, collectively, for democracy to function, we need to be able to rely on the media to educate people about what's happening and to elevate the level of conversation we have about difficult, complex civic issues. I think across the country, there's been a real deficit when it comes to our understanding of complex issues like public safety, criminal justice, police accountability in the last couple of years. And I think that's a trend we see in part because of the way that social media is impacting news coverage, right? The ways in which journalists are being evaluated based on how many clicks they get, how many new subscriptions their articles generate. And in many ways, that leads to a lowest common denominator form of journalism, people racing to get a tweet out, to break a story. Very, very little accountability, as we saw with President Trump, for blatant misinformation being spread, sometimes through mainstream media sources. If we're going to, look, the criminal justice system has never worked in this country. I inherited a system that was entirely dysfunctional. 2/3 of people getting out of prison statewide will be rearrested within a couple of years. In San Francisco, before I was elected, more than half of people released pre-trial would be rearrested while their case was pending. That's the system I inherited. On day one, I had 5,000 open criminal cases. 20% of them were more than 2 years old. So if we're going to fix that system, we need journalism to play a part in elevating the conversation. I think there's been far too much focus on Twitter dunks, on viral sound bites or videos. Let's take one example. You mentioned a video of someone stealing from Walgreens. That video went literally viral.
International.
Millions of people around the world saw that video. It generated hundreds of news stories. And the tweet said, #no consequences at Chesa Boudin. Now, here's what's problematic. That was a journalist who put that tweet out. Here's what's really, really unethical. And
Is that a local journalist?
It was.
ABC stuff.
Yeah, that's fine.
Here's what's unethical about that kind of journalism.
Wasn't public media.
It was. I mean, I'm just saying.
Just facts.
Yeah, I read the story.
Just
The
facts.
tweet, yeah.
Here's what's problematic about that kind of journalism. So for there to be consequences in any criminal case, the first step is there has to be an arrest. In fact, the National Institute for Justice has published lots of research that shows the single biggest deterrent in criminal cases is not the severity of punishment, but is certainty of arrest. And we all watched as the guy went right past a security guard who didn't try to arrest him or detain him, and it took weeks before an arrest was made. Once an arrest was made, he spent 16 months in jail. He suffered a felony conviction. To say no consequences, to suggest that that crime or any crime is the responsibility of one elected official is really dishonest and dumbs down a conversation that we need to be having at a high level.
I want to ask a quick follow-up. It says audience questions, but where are the audience questions? I don't have any. Oh, Ryan, get over here. All right, thanks. What role do you think race plays in, that's a silly question, but it's a big question, in those videos and how they're responded to and, all these things, the way the media responds to it?
As long as this country has been around, race has played, and look, James Baldwin wrote brilliantly about the ways in which white consciousness is caught up in the relationship to Black America decades ago. We know that the criminal justice system is racist. We know that policing in this country is racist. And we know that racism has deep, deep roots, written into our Constitution, right? We don't need to look any further than the 3/5 clause. We don't need to look any further than slavery to know that racism has been and continues to be a very serious problem. And the criminal justice system, for decades, has served to amplify institutional racism that starts in maybe less visible or less pernicious ways in public housing and education and healthcare and employment. And when people don't have access to jobs or don't have access to mortgages to buy a home or get addicted and can't get treatment, and they get arrested, those kinds of videos and the tough on crime, police union rhetoric that we're seeing all across the country right now tells people that they'll be safer if only we exact vengeance and retribution on people who don't look like us. It is dangerous, it's dishonest, it's racist, and it undermines public safety.
Before we get to this question, I just, we're talking about the media and how this has been driven, and one thing we do have a history of in this state especially is, using individual cases to often drive policy or conversations around
Willie
criminal
Horton
justice. Willie Horton's a great example. That was not in California, but yeah. Polyclass, and three strikes. But so one of the cases here has been a case of a man, Troy McAllister, who had been sitting in jail for 5 years awaiting trial on charges of holding somebody up with a toy gun.
Yeah, fake gun, yeah.
And when you came in, your office made a plea deal. He got out on time served and went on to be rearrested throughout the year. Your office referred him to parole. Daly City got a report that he had stolen a car right before New Year's Eve, had the address that he was at in his name, didn't arrest him, and then he ends up killing 2 women with this car. Setting aside, I want to make clear that there's a lot of other criminal justice partners who touched this case between when your plea deal was made and when, this horrific accident occurred, or
Crime.
whatever you want to call it, yeah. Accident, yeah, collision. But why that kind of plea deal? And I know it's hard, I think litigating individual cases is not always useful, but this is one we hear a lot. And this is an attack we hear in LA against George Gascon, which is, you could have gone for 25 years to life. You could have gone for X, Y, or Z. Can you just talk about the thinking that goes into that and what sort of factors you're looking at?
That case was a devastating tragedy. I met with the mother of Hanako Abe. We reached out to the family of Elizabeth Platt. The pain that those families experienced, the hole in their social fabric will never be filled. And of course, I lay awake at night thinking, what could we have done differently? We don't have a crystal ball. We can't predict the future conduct of every single one of the thousands and thousands of people that come through San Francisco's Hall of Justice every year. And we also can't put everybody in prison for life. The logic that says this could have been prevented if only he had been in prison for longer is a logic that leads us to mass incarceration. It's a logic that leads us to the death penalty. It's a logic that leads us to bankrupting our governments because we're only investing in building jails and prisons, not investing in building schools and hospitals. We know where that path leads. It does not lead to safety. It does not lead to the kind of vibrant community that I want my son to grow up in. And we know how the class family, the family for which the three strikes law at issue in this case, that I'll come back to, the Troy McAllister case, feel about the three strikes law that was passed in their sister's name.
Some of their family, but yeah.
Her sisters.
Yeah, her sisters. I spoke with them
are,
yesterday. Yeah.
And they're outspoken critics of the three strikes law that's named after their sister. They are supporters of my efforts to stop relying on what are called status enhancements. Now, the maximum punishment for a robbery under California law is 5 years. And Troy McAllister served a 5-year sentence.
Yeah.
Now, you're right that we could have been creative and found ways to keep him in prison for longer. And if we had a crystal ball, we might have done that. But we have to make decisions in cases based on the information available. He had, believe it or not, a really good record in county jail.
Well, I wanted to ask that because 5 years in county is not necessarily access to rehabilitation or a lot of the programs that you believe helps people change. So in a case like that, are you considering that?
Absolutely.
What they've done?
Absolutely. We had letters of recommendation from case managers. We had certificates of completion from programs that he'd done. He was in a trusted job. Look, I'm not here to defend him. I'm prosecuting him right now.
Yeah.
But we make decisions one case at a time with the information we have available.
Well, here's an audience question. Do you regret any decision you made while in office?
Absolutely. Lots of them. And it's been a steep learning curve. So let me give you one example, and it's related to the Troy McAllister case. Marisa, you mentioned that he was referred several times to the Division of Parole. Now, going back to when the US Supreme Court ruled California's overcrowded prisons to be unconstitutional, well before I was in office, I think 2012, and when realignment happened. The state prison system that also oversees the Division of Parole has asked every elected district attorney in the state not to use their authority to file parole revocations. Now, we're getting technical, and I'm going to ask you to bear with me. My wife says I'm sometimes trying to teach our son to drink out of a sippy cup with a 5-point plan, and I get a little in the weeds. So, but this stuff matters. The details matter. When I took office, we had a policy that predated me by about a decade of respecting parole's request not to file our own parole revocations. In other words, if somebody like Troy McAllister was arrested and we didn't have enough evidence or it wasn't a serious enough case to file charges against him, we would refer the case to parole and let them decide what to do. Now, there are reasons for that policy, but I really regret not questioning it before his case, because what I saw was parole wasn't getting the job done. I'm not saying this is a criticism of parole. Pandemic, limited resources, lots of challenges. But at the end of the day, as much as we rely on each other as partners, I also need to take responsibility for the decisions my office makes. And we can't simply say we're going to refer to another agency and it's not our problem. It is our problem. Public safety in San Francisco is my problem. It is my challenge. It is my job. I take it seriously, and I want to do everything I can to make sure San Francisco is safe. So after that case, we took a hard look at what we could have done differently. And now, unlike pretty much any other county in the state of California, I have a dedicated lawyer, happens to be a former public defender, who focuses on parole revocations. And I'll tell you something. I don't micromanage. I don't get in the weeds. He does his own thing. And he has filed more parole revocations since we changed that policy than the Division of Parole has filed. It's not just that we're doing it at the margins. It's that we're taking the lead on making decisions about when someone on parole has committed a violation that's so serious that we need to hold them in jail.
Do you think that system is effective? Are they getting help that they need if we're talking about parole revocations, which are generally short stays in state prison or local lockups, right?
That's right. When it comes to rehabilitation and reentry, San Francisco, like the rest of the country, has massively underinvested in reentry programming, in drug treatment. Look, we prosecute drug sales cases higher than almost any other case police bring us. More than 80% of felony drug sale cases police bring us, we file a new case in. It's not working for the Tenderloin. It's not working to prevent overdoses for reasons that any of us who lived through the war on drugs can understand and appreciate. We need to invest in drug treatment. We need to invest in mental health counseling. We need to invest in housing for people who are struggling. And that's true of people on the streets in the Tenderloin, and it's true of people getting out of jail or prison. That's how we build safety, reentry planning, public health, those kinds of services, not through my office, but the city and the county and the state have to step up and intervene in ways that we know can prevent future crimes.
Yeah. Some people are arrested again and again for non-violent crimes like selling fentanyl. Do you believe in locking up repeat non-violent criminals? If yes, can you give an example? And if no, what's your plan when diversion doesn't work?
You know, I think it really is a case-by-case question, and we try to get at the root causes of crime and address. So look, the criminal justice system has been really good at meting out punishment and ratcheting up punishment in ways that are disproportionate to anything known to the civilized world. We're not good at holding people accountable in ways that prevent future crime anywhere in the country. Whether you go to Sacramento, where you've got a Republican pretend independent, pretend independent, real Republican, supposedly tough on crime prosecutor, but not so tough that she's willing to prosecute police who commit domestic violence in her county until after we file charges against them, right? But putting that aside, right, you don't find those kinds of tough on crime approaches being more successful at reducing crime rates or preventing recidivism. What's effective, and the California Policy Lab report shows this, 10 years worth of data, diversion programs are more effective. Now, if someone continues to commit crimes, we need to intervene in a way that protects our community. And absolutely there is a role for jail and prison to play. It should be a role of last resort, but it needs to be there until we come up with a better solution. That guy in that viral video that some unethical journalist said was my fault served a 16-month sentence. So that was a property crime. That was a nonviolent offense. He was a repeat offender. We looked at the case, we looked at what had been tried, and we realized we didn't have better options. I think it's a failure of our collective imagination and creativity when someone who's drug addicted, homeless, committing nonviolent crimes is in jail because we don't have better options. But sometimes we don't have better options. And I'm going to do whatever it takes to keep our city safe.
Yeah.
And that was a felony case?
We charged him with numerous felonies. He was convicted ultimately of a felony and a misdemeanor.
Yeah. Another audience question, is San Francisco following the 3 strikes law, and what is the policy for felons who have committed multiple felonies?
So the 3 strikes law is a little bit different than someone with multiple felonies. The 3 strikes law only applies to certain categories of felonies, what we call serious or violent felonies, prior convictions. We have a policy that the default is we will not use prior strikes. In other words, if someone commits a robbery, we'll prosecute them for the robbery. If they commit a murder, we'll prosecute them for the murder. But it's a policy that is subject to exceptions, and we make exceptions on a regular basis when the facts and the circumstances so require. In other words, if somebody's facing murder, they're already facing a life sentence, then we don't need to rely on a prior conviction to increase the sentencing exposure. If someone was just recently convicted of a serious and violent crime and they're back again with a new serious violent crime, we're going to use that prior sentence to enhance it. But at the end of the day, the calculus is looking at what we think is a necessary sentence exposure to protect public safety and to have consequences that meet the severity of the crime.
We are out of time, but we want to give you a chance to make your closing argument to the jury, to the voters.
Well, I'll tell you what, my brother's a 6th grade science teacher in the East Bay, and he invites me to speak to his classroom pretty much every year, and that is a way more intimidating audience than any San Francisco jury has ever been. So I really appreciate being in a room full of adults. But the thing about it is this: we measure criminal justice outcomes in time frames, time horizons that are far longer than I've been in office. We have serious challenges when it comes to public safety, and the recall does not want you to think about how to fix them. Politics are getting in the way of good policy. Everybody you trust opposes the recall. The Democratic Party, the Green Party, the ACLU, the Sierra Club, the Rose Pack Democratic Club, Bernal Heights Democratic Club, the Labor Council, the nurses, the in-home healthcare workers, every single elected or formerly elected official who has taken a position opposes this recall. The teachers. Now, who supports the recall? Billionaire Republicans are bankrolling it, and the San Francisco Republican Party has endorsed it. Ted Cruz, Tom Cotton are tweeting about why I need to be recalled. And let's be really clear. These are the people who are responsible for eroding women's right to make choices about their own body. These are the people responsible for undermining voting rights, for undermining gun control laws. These are the people who packed the Supreme Court. They do not reflect San Francisco values. They do not reflect policies that are grounded in evidence that will make us safer. They don't care about victims' rights. They use victims as pieces of evidence to secure criminal convictions and lengthy sentences. And if they're not helpful for that, they don't use them. We have got to do better. We've got to be smarter. We've got to follow the lead of folks who are paying attention on the ground to the work that we're doing every day. Vote no on Proposition H on June 7th.
All right, those ballots go out in about a week. Thanks so much to District Attorney Chesa Boudin for being here tonight. Thanks to all of you for joining us in person and online.
You can join more civic events like this right here at KQED Live from the Commons. This Thursday, former Stockton Mayor Michael Tubbs and his wife, scholar and author Anna Malaika Tubbs, will be here for a conversation about the political and moral power of motherhood.
And on Tuesday, May 17th, we're going to be hosting the annual Night of Ideas featuring more than a dozen Bay Area thinkers and artists, so you can come for that as well. You can learn about all these events, get tickets at kqed.org/live. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.